Greetings, welcome to Facts About Everything. I'm your host, James Egan. At the end of 2018, I did a video talking about the people that we lost that year, including, obviously, Stan Lee. As I said in that video, Stan Lee created over 600 comic book characters, including... However, the most popular person that Stan Lee created was Spider-Man. But I also point out that Spider-Man was also created by Stan Lee's partner, Steve Ditko. Even though Steve Ditko died last year, his death was completely overlooked because Stan Lee passed away the same year. At the end of Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, the film is dedicated to Stan Lee and Steve Ditko, and when that appeared on the screen, there was people in the audience who were like, who? This made me realize how overlooked so many comic book writers are. If you don't read comics, chances are you can't name a single comic book writer apart from Stan Lee. And you might think to yourself, yeah, but people who read comics know who writes them, right? Some comic book writers are so obscure that the guy who created Batman, his name isn't even mentioned in the first few films. His name is never said at any point or credited on Batman or Batman Returns. And he made the character. That's how obscure and forgotten and overlooked these people are, creating these characters that then make hundreds of millions or billions of dollars and just completely dismissed. So I'm doing a video looking at the most influential comic writers of all time. I will not be talking about Stan Lee because I already did a video completely dedicated to him. It was actually the first comic book video I ever did on my channel. I'll leave a link at the end of this video if you want to check that out. So without further ado, this is 100 facts about comic book writers. Let's dive in. I'm going to try and do this alphabetically, except the first one. I'm going to talk about Steve Ditko, because explaining who Steve Ditko is actually is very good at helping you understand why comic book writers get forgotten. You see, Stan Lee created the concept of Spider-Man. He invented the idea in his head of a guy walking on walls shooting a web. And he wrote the dialogue for Spider-Man. Steve Ditko was the artist of Spider-Man, so he created this image. And this is a problem. There is almost no character in any comic that was completely created by one person from scratch. Very rarely are you very good at dialogue and art, so it's always one or the other. As a result, nearly every character you can possibly think of was created by at least 2 people. Some of them were created by 4, 5, or even 6 people. And Steve Ditko did not like the fact that Stan Lee was known as the creator of Spider-Man, because he said, who is Spider-Man? The dialogue he says, or this image? Ask any kid which one is Spider-Man, they're going to point at the image every time. As a result, Stan Lee had to say in Steve Ditko's contract, he said, in my opinion, Steve Ditko is the co-creator of Spider-Man. He created him as much as I did. Steve Ditko did not like this, as he said, you're saying in your opinion. You're not saying I am the co-creator of Spider-Man. But to make peace, he said, we'll cut 50-50. I own half of Spider-Man, you own half of Spider-Man. But this was never enough for Steve Ditko, and he eventually left. Everyone connected to Marvel hated how Spider-Man looked when Steve Ditko drew him, because you couldn't see any part of his face. Before that, usually supervillains obscured their face, and superheroes would have an eye mask like Robin, or a face mask like Captain America. Not seeing any part of the face people thought was distrusting. Nevertheless, Spider-Man became a huge success, and Steve Ditko actually popularized masks with no visible facial features for other superheroes. Because Steve Ditko wrote the comics of Spider-Man for many years, he is the co-creator of nearly every one of the early Spider-Man villains. The Chameleon, Green Goblin, Vulture, Scorpion, the Lizard, and many others. There are some people in the comic industry, in the biz, who are quite hostile to Stan Lee, thinking that he was taking credit for stuff that wasn't his. Based on his interviews, it sounds like he did the opposite. Just to make things easier, he said, okay, you and me, we made Spider-Man 50-50. But he said, in the first couple of issues, Steve Ditko would sometimes do 90 to 99% of the work. Stan Lee would just say something like, okay, in this issue, let Spider-Man fight a bad guy made of sand. That's it. That's all he said. And Steve Ditko would not only do the art, but would write the dialogue. You know that part in a comic book where the superhero makes a long, preachy speech about how the world could be better? Steve Ditko popularized that concept. Spider-Man probably does this more than any other Marvel superhero. Although this is commonplace nowadays, Marvel writers mocked it and would even call him Ditko the Dictator. Throughout his life, Steve Ditko was incredibly reclusive and never gave interviews. Spider-Man is not the only Marvel superhero that Steve Ditko created. He also created Doctor Strange. Now let's look at who is considered to be the greatest comic book writer of all time, Alan Moore. He is famous for writing Watchmen, From Hell, Swamp Thing, The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, and V for Vendetta. Although he didn't create Swamp Thing, he did change it from a good comic book to one of the greatest DC comics of all time. Watchmen is often considered to be the greatest comic ever written. It is the only comic book that appears in Times Magazine list the 100 greatest novels. So what did he think of the Watchmen movie? He said it was, quote, regurgitated worms. By the way, he's never seen it. He is the only person to win the Hugo Award for a comic book. The following year, the rules were changed, so comic books couldn't be considered. Why? Because they're not good enough? If that's true, then why did you give it to him? He usually wears at least 10 rings on his fingers. He is very private and goes by many pseudonyms including Kurt Vile, Jill DeRay, and Translucia Baboon. He has been credited as the original writer in some of his work. He demanded that his name be removed from the films based on his work, even though he hasn't seen them, including From Hell, V for Vendetta, and The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. Although he is known as a comic book writer, he says he has many jobs including cartoonist, novelist, musician, magician, wizard, Rasputin impersonator, and mall Santa. And if you think that's the weirdest thing about him, he worships a 2nd century human-headed snake god called Glycon. And now let's look at the creator of Batman. Despite the fact many sources say it's Bob Kane, it isn't. Batman was created by Bill Finger. Bill Finger was never credited for The Dark Knight because he had no managerial skills. Bob Kane was so charming that he got all the credit. His name wasn't mentioned in any Batman comics or films until recently. Although Bob Kane was a bit of a jerk, he did understand that Bill Finger was absurdly talented. He said Finger was, quote, the Cecil B. DeMille of the comics. DeMille is one of the most influential film directors of all time. He made historic epics such as Cleopatra and The Ten Commandments. He also created Catwoman, Penguin, Two-Face, Scarecrow, Clayface, Hugo Strange, who was supposed to be Batman's arch-nemesis, Sal Maroni, Tony Zuko, and of course, the Joker. But that's just the villains. He also created Robin, Alfred, Vicky Vale, who's Bruce's love interest in the first Batman film, and Commissioner James Gordon. He said his favorite superhero was the Phantom, who was also the first superhero ever created. He even predates Superman. The reason why he liked the Phantom is because he didn't rely on superpowers. Bill Finger implemented this in his idea for Batman. He concocted Batman's suit, including the grey outfit, black cape, and the pointy-eared cowl. He also devised the Joker's laughing gas. He concocted the idea of the Penguin having an umbrella as a weapon. One thing I've never really liked about Bill Finger, but he created it so you kind of have to incorporate into the Batman, is he really liked having characters fighting around oversized functional props. This is why Batman has an overly large coin in his Batcave. And in the comics, he would fight in a giant typewriter and some weird stuff like that. Bill Finger also created Green Lantern. He also created Green Lantern's villain, Black Hand, whose appearance is based on Bill Finger. Although Bob Kane wanted Batman's eyes to be black, Bill convinced him that Batman should have white eyes. Not only did he create the appearance of Batman, but he created his entire backstory. Okay, now let's look at the other one, Bob Kane. He personally recommended Jack Nicholson for the role of the Joker in the 1989 film Batman. So Bob Kane didn't invent Batman, he created Birdman. See, Bruce Wayne was originally Birdman, and Finger reworked the character in what we now know as Batman. He was supposed to fly using a glider based on the sketch by Leonardo da Vinci. And you surely have noticed that, yes, Michael Keaton has played Batman and Birdman. And then he played another Birdman as Vulture and Spider-Man. I'm not even going to make a joke about it. It's too obvious. Although Kane said he regretted mistreating Finger, he never allowed him to be credited as the creator of Batman. In fact, he was never even referred to as the co-creator. If you felt bad, then why'd you do it, you jerk? When he signed autographs, he usually wrote, Bats wishes always. He was supposed to have a cameo in the Batman film, but he declined due to poor health. He created the character Mr. Freeze. He said he borrowed, or stole, inspiration from the 1930 film The Bat Whispers for the Batman comics. It sounds like Bob Kane is a scumbag for stealing the idea from Bill Finger. However, Bob Kane does get a lot of credit. It was Kane's idea to make Batman a superhero vigilante. Bill Finger wanted Batman to be a scientific detective. He copied a lot of his artwork from other writers. The design for the cover of Batman's debut was blatantly stolen from a Flash Gordon comic. He retired from writing comics in 1966. Although he liked the Batman films, he felt they didn't focus on the storyline. One of the last films Bob Kane ever saw was Batman and Robin. It probably killed him. Okay, we looked at the two creators of Batman, but now let's look at the guy who made the Batman we know today, Frank Miller. For nearly half a century, Batman was a goofy character. It was Frank Miller that turned him into a psychological, dark, broody vigilante that we know today. His most famous work is Batman: The Dark Knight Returns, which revolves around an elderly Bruce Wayne who is forced to come out of retirement and become Batman once more after the world has become too corrupt. Shortly after, he wrote Batman Year One, detailing the first time Bruce Wayne became Batman. When he was asked where he got the idea to write about an elderly Batman, he said, "I realized that I was about to turn 30, and Batman was permanently 29, and I was going to be damned if I was older than Batman." He wrote Sin City and 300. His heroes usually revolve around an uncompromisable moral person surviving in a corrupt environment. Miller nearly always wears a fedora hat. He nearly directed A Nightmare on Elm Street. He draws and writes his work in a gritty film noir style. This is most obvious with Sin City. If you ever noticed that Daredevil is quite similar to Batman, that's not a coincidence. Frank Miller retooled Daredevil during the 1980s, making him a much more popular character. In these stories, he created the character Elektra. He absolutely hated the idea of turning Sin City into a film. After being on set for one day, he changed his mind and asked to have a part in the movie. He played the priest that Marv kills. He usually writes characters who are blind or mute. Daredevil and Stick are blind. In a Sin City series, Miho and Kevin never speak. He also usually has characters beaten to the brink of death and have them surgically fixed. This happens to Dwight in Sin City. Frank Miller has never seen a Batman film that he liked. He wrote, drew, and inked all the Sin City comics. Although Frank Miller's influence on the world of comics is unquestionable, his work has dramatically declined in recent years. His 2005 story, All-Star Batman and Robin, The Boy Wondered, is considered to be the worst Batman story ever. But it is not the worst story ever. Okay, everything I just said is great, but it doesn't end well, sadly, with Frank Miller. You see, in 2011, he created a comic called Holy Terror, which is one of the worst comic books ever written. It revolves around a superhero called The Fixer who battles against Islamic terrorists. The story is nonsensical, the dialogue is laughable, the art is abysmal, the characters are ridiculous, and the writing is really Islamophobic. Miller couldn't defend this since he has been vocally passionate for his disdain for the Middle East. The main character was supposed to be Batman, but DC Comics wanted nothing to do with the comic. Originally, Miller wanted to call the story Holy Terror Batman. Yes, that's actually what he was going to call it. This book is so hated, few bookstores will even sell it, and it's difficult to buy through conventional means. Everybody knows Stan Lee was the big guy during the 60s. So who's the biggest writer now? And the answer is Grant Morrison. I'm sure there's some diehard comic book fans who will give me a whole list of why that's wrong, but just bear with me on this. Morrison is one of the most influential comic book writers in the last 2 decades. In fact, Comic Book Resources voted him as the second most influential comic book writer ever. He is best known for writing New X-Men, DC 1 Million, and Final Crisis. Although he didn't create the DC superhero Animal Man, Morrison turned him into a gritty superhero, which he has remained to this day. By the way, Animal Man is one of my favorite superheroes ever. He is phenomenal, and that's all thanks to Grant Morrison's portrayal of the character. However, Grant Morrison's crowning achievement is All-Star Superman, which is often considered to be the greatest Superman comic ever. Grant Morrison wrote a comic called The Invisibles. The Invisibles is about a man that learns he is the Messiah and can bend the rules of reality. A bald, bespectacled mentor tells the Messiah that the world is secretly controlled by demon insects. If that sounds familiar, that's because this idea was stolen and used for the Matrix. Apart from the demon insects bit. You know what's weird? Everything I just said, that story, Grant Morrison believes it. That's not a joke. He firmly believes that humanity is in a war with demon insects. In case you couldn't figure it out, Morrison takes all of the drugs, and he admits he is really high during panels and interviews. Morrison is an incredible writer, but he is a completely unique type of crazy. You probably think it's a bit unfair for the Matrix directors, the Wachowskis, to copy Morrison's work. However, Alan Moore believes it is Morrison who is the imitator. He is adamant that Morrison copies Moore's materials. In Moore's own words, quote, "I've read his work twice, once when I wrote, and again when he did." Morrison began publishing comic strips when he was only 17. He was responsible for killing off Jean Grey in the X-Men story, Planet X. That was 18 years ago, and to the best of my knowledge, Jean Grey has stayed dead, which is very, very rare for a comic book. In Morrison's comics, his characters usually break the fourth wall. Sometimes Morrison himself appears in his stories. He created Batman's son, Damian Wayne, better known as Robin. Okay, now let's look at the creator of Marvel Comics, Jack Kirby. I mean, technically the founder of Marvel Comics was Martin Goodman, and Jack Kirby was the primary artist. But Martin Goodman, that's another guy that everyone forgets. You see what I mean? Everyone thinks it's Stan Lee. Stan Lee, you're great, but give some people some credit. Jack Kirby created Black Panther, Silver Surfer, Groot, Doctor Doom, and Captain America. And for the record, Stan Lee did not create Captain America in any way. Jack Kirby co-created Thor, the X-Men, Hulk, Ant-Man and Iron Man. Jack Kirby was famous for his realistic art during fight scenes. Jack Kirby was known as the king of the comics. When Tonight Show host and comedian Johnny Carson heard of this, he was infuriated because he thought Kirby, who he never heard of, was claiming to be the king of stand-up comedy, not comic books. Jack Kirby's parents were Austrian Jewish immigrants. Unsurprisingly, it was his idea to make the X-Men's nemesis Magneto a Jew who was held captive in the concentration camp Auschwitz. While writing for Captain America, Jack Kirby received a phone call at his studio that informed him that 3 Nazis were waiting downstairs to beat him up. He rolled up his sleeves and marched down, but the Nazis ran away. Jack Kirby created so many characters that he actually had to stop driving because he would brainstorm and daydream so often, create new superheroes and stories that he couldn't concentrate, and he regularly crashed his car. He is personally responsible for creating many black superheroes, including Black Panther, Black Racer, and Flipper Dipper. Okay, not all of them are winners. He popularized splash panels. A splash panel is when a single image is depicted on 1 or 2 pages. They are often used during a turning point in a fight or the death of a single figure. Most final pages of comics are a splash panel. He was a veteran in World War II. He had 4 children with his wife. He said his wife was the most important person in the world, and he incorporated his love for her in his characters Mr. Miracle and his lover, Big Barda. Barda is famous for being one of the only superheroines who is inarguably stronger than her husband. When the Fantastic Four met God in one issue, God is drawn to look like Jack Kirby. Kirby had a falling out with Stan Lee, forcing Kirby to leave Marvel. It is unclear why, but it's probably to do with the fact that Kirby received no royalties from the characters that he created. After he left Marvel, he worked for DC Comics and created many stories for DC, including The New Gods. He also created one of DC's biggest villains, Darkseid. Jack Kirby said he preferred working at DC because he was paid royalties for his characters. He said his greatest achievement in comics was to create the New God story in DC Comics. The 2012 film Argo tells a true story of a CIA agent pretending to make a science fiction film in Tehran while he's secretly attempting to rescue 6 Americans. All the artwork for this non-existent film was drawn by Jack Kirby. That's right, Jack Kirby's art actually saved hostages from terrorists, because Jack Kirby is awesome. Okay, let's go back to the very beginning and look at Jerry Siegel. Jerry Siegel created the character of Superman in Action Comics #1, which was released on June 1st, 1938. He wrote the story with his partner, Joe Shuster. The comic was only 10 cents, but can cost at least 400 grand today if the copy is in mint condition. The comic is seen as the beginning of the golden age of comics. In 1929, Siegel self-published a book called Cosmic Stories. Historians see this book as the very first science fiction fanzine ever. Siegel was only 15 at the time. He served in the army from 1943 to 1946. He was posted in Honolulu. During that time, he wrote a comic strip about Super Sam, a soldier who gained superpowers after receiving a blood transfusion from Superman. Siegel got in trouble for this since he made the strip without receiving permission from DC Comics, but he created the character. He left DC Comics in 1948. He returned from time to time to work on some stories revolving around Bizarro and the Legion of Superheroes. His partner, Joe Shuster, never worked for DC Comics ever again after he left in 1946. Jerry Siegel's wife, Joan, was the model for Lois Lane. He created other comic book characters including the Spectre, Superboy, Brainiac 5, Dr. Occult, and Matter Eater Lad, who was considered to be the worst named superhero ever. He worked as a proofreader for Marvel in 1963. Because Marvel was seen as DC's competition, Siegel worked under the pseudonym Joe Carter. Stan Lee hired Siegel because he was, quote, down on his luck at the time. After Siegel left DC Comics, he never had much success. The only character he created for Marvel Comics, Plant Man, is so obscure even the most diehard fans have never heard of him. Although he created 2 superheroes for Charlton Comics, Mr. Muscles and Nature Boy, neither lasted more than 3 issues. He only worked for Archie Comics for less than a year before the company decided to cancel their superhero line. Siegel died in 1996 when he was 81. Now let's look at Neil Gaiman, who's most famous for writing Sandman. Sandman became so popular, it separated from DC and created its own brand new comic book company, which is called Vertigo and was designed for mature readers. The most famous Vertigo comics are V for Vendetta, The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, From Hell, and Watchmen. He came up with the origins of the Batman villains Poison Ivy and the Riddler. His stories usually revolve around immortality, mirrors, twins, and myth. His father worked in the Scientology Public Relations Department. He has co-written books with the late Terry Pratchett, who is most famous for writing the Discworld series. He wrote Coraline, which was adapted into a film in 2009. He often integrates the moon and stars in his art. He decided to become a comic book writer after reading Swamp Thing by Alan Moore. As I said, Swamp Thing, it's amazing. It never gets enough credit. He's from Hampshire, from England. I live in Hampshire. Probably lives down the road. He got married in 2011. And let's finish up with a writer who's not connected with Marvel or DC, Todd McFarlane, who was the founder of Image Comics and the creator of Spawn. Although Spawn isn't as popular as Batman or Spider-Man, the debut issue, which was released in 1992, is the most successful launch comic in history. He wrote and drew Spider-Man stories during the 1980s and 1990s. His look of Spider-Man was actually implemented for the movie Amazing Spider-Man 2. He is famous for his absurd attention to detail over minor things like fingernails, shoelaces, teeth, facial hair. He created Spawn when he was 16. Todd McFarlane was rejected as a comic writer 700 times, and he personally received 350 rejection letters. He has every rejection letter to this day. And finally, he was the first artist to ever draw the Spider-Man villain, Venom. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe. Please let me know if there's any other comics you want me to do a video about, and I'll upload it as soon as possible. To learn more facts, check out my books. They're available on Amazon on paperback and Kindle. Thanks for watching. See you again.